So hi everybody, thanks for coming to the Rough Cut this week. It's now something completely different. I met Melissa. We both serving on the Research Council for the Vice President for Research, and when I heard about her, what she does, it's like, wow, you need to come and talk at a Rough Cut. So I'm really glad she's here now. She has been here 3 years at MSU, and she's an assistant professor in art history. She got her PhD at University of Virginia. And her research interests are modern and contemporary art, criticism, and the history of science, especially ecology. So that's perked my interest. And her current book project is entitled Viewers and Other Animals, Formalism and Environmental Aesthetics After World War II. So she's the first speaker we've ever had from arts and architecture, so I'm really thrilled to have you here. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd like to thank Kathy for inviting me. As she said, I'm a historian of modern and contemporary art, and what I specialize in is actually the intellectual history of art, and that includes the sciences, and I am very interested in ecology and also psychology. There's kind of a small area called art psychology that exists for about 20 years in the middle of the 20th century that I write about. And one of the projects of eco-criticism within art history is to kind of redirect scholarly inquiry toward historical transformations in the way that we think about the environment, and to kind of recast cultural artifacts in an environmental context of interconnectedness, sustainability, justice. All of these ideas are central, whether or not we're talking about work that is obviously ecological. And it's not exactly a methodology. It might still call up methodologies from psychoanalysis or Marxism without sort of contradicting that central premise. But its basic tenet is to move humanistic disciplines away from anthropocentrism, which of course they are the humanities, towards something that might consider the non-human world. And for me, this means asking questions about how environmental ideas affect how artists talk about form. And the ways that works of art might provoke action. And when I first chatted with Kathy about this, she asked me if that meant that I wrote about landscapes. And no, I don't, but I thought it might be nice, here's my clicker. I thought it might be nice to start with one. Where do I point it? Can we go to the next one? Ah, haha. And this is an especially important landscape. This is Thomas Cole's view from Mount Holyoke, also known as the Oxbow. And it's from the sort of more populous eastern half of the United States. But Cole makes it feel like we're standing at the edge of civilization. And it's these sorts of boundary conditions that Cole is really interested in, those places where wildness contacts that sort of pastoral idyll that's happening in the right half of this image. And his entire body of work addresses a lot of the anxieties and conflicting interests of the 19th century. Wilderness, for instance, as a way to access God's original creation, and a countervailing belief promoted especially by Andrew Jackson in territorial expansion as something that is divinely mandated. And we can't really apply any properly modern sense of the word ecological to Cole. He actually died well before the term was coined in 1866. And his views on nature were primarily filtered through Christian moralism, German romanticism, a British taste for the picturesque, as well as Whiggish politics, and a pretty good allegiance to the aristocratic class that were his patrons. So this work is actually as much an argument against runaway populism as it is an argument for conservation. And you can see that a little bit better in this image. This is a scene from Cole's Course of Empire, the Consummation of Empire from 1834. And it depicts nature overwhelmed by development, by consumption, by a breakdown of what he considered kind of natural social hierarchies, and what Cole saw as necessary restrictions on individual liberties. Angela Miller, who's another art historian, has argued that this figure, this tiny little figure here, is actually an image of Andrew Jackson, and that what Cole is doing is satirizing Jackson as a kind of new Caesar, both for his abuses of executive power and for the kind of despotic Indian Removal Act of 1830. So paintings like this were early recognitions of the ways that social order could impact the natural world and ultimately endanger human survival. This is a very small screen for a very large image. Hopefully you can see here that consummation of empire, everything is on fire, bodies are falling off of that beautiful bridge that you just saw in the previous image. And this is the next scene in the series in which all we have are architectural ruins. So Cole's view of nature and of history was ultimately very cyclical. Man really endangered only himself through warfare and disease. Nature was a kind of separate, indomitable realm that ultimately persists regardless of whether mankind does. And so far, at least within the history of art, criticism has directed itself primarily toward images like these, 18th and 19th century representational images of nature. Though even at this moment in the 1830s, abstraction was already emerging as a fruitful tool for thinking about the environment and how it could be altered. These are two paintings that are roughly contemporaneous with the ones we just saw, again, both from the 1830s. The one on the left is by John Constable, the one on the right is by Turner. And they're both showing us the same thing. It's the Waterloo Bridge over the Thames. And Ruskin actually makes a sort of important historical argument for Turner's work that it is more truthful, in part because it doesn't appeal to the slavish depiction of detail, a kind of attention to imitation that Constable does. Instead, what we see is an interest, an emerging interest in the experience of light and space that occupies the Impressionists at the end of the 19th century. So it's what amounts to ultimately an abstract landscape. His version of the Waterloo Bridge doesn't really show us the Thames or the bridge, but rather the kind of visual conditions of that environment. And that particular environment in London in the 19th century was filled with mist and smoke, something we might call smog now. One researcher at Irvine actually talks about these as polluted images because they try to picture through obfuscation what is actually a pervasive environmental condition. The image on the left, I'm jumping a little bit, is from 1970. It's a book filled with full bleed monochromatic pages titled L.A. Air, or Los Angeles Air, by Bruce Nauman. And it doesn't deal with the kind of coal smog from the 19th century that Turner does, but rather deals with a new photochemical smog identified in the 1950s that dissipates rather than masks its objects. So artists like Nauman and even Turner are dealing with representational challenges that are sort of distant from Cole, who could still think about a kind of romantic ideal of an unspoiled wildness. So what Nauman is doing on the left is using these kind of deep blues and reds to call up all of those vivid colors associated with Los Angeles sunsets, and that we only know because of the book's title, because of the way that it is framed by language. So I've jumped a little bit to the period that I actually work on, which is after World War II, and it's long after Ruskin defends Turner's abstract paintings. And by this point, abstraction was not only acceptable as a painterly choice, but according to certain critics, it comes to exemplify what it means for a painting to be properly modern. Painting should not only announce its flatness, the flatness of the pictorial form, but it should only address the visual field. It should speak to eyesight alone. And this kind of rigid program put forward by people like Clement Greenberg and Michael Fried begins to feel really dogmatic and stifling to a younger generation of artists like Nauman. So around 1970, you get a range of practices that arise under the banner of post-formalism. Some people call it post-minimalism. And it includes things like body art, land art, conceptual art, and all of these things question the centrality of vision and stable images. This is an example. It's a sort of landscape. This is Robert Barry's Inert Gas series from 1969. And as the post in post-formalism suggests, it's a period that comes after minimalism, after the repetitive geometric objects that were produced in the early 1960s. In the late 1960s and early 70s, were less about the production of these well-built objects than about producing a set of conditions that somebody could experience as art. And artists were increasingly skeptical of all of the boundary conditions that had come to define good form, as well as the boundedness of the art world, the autonomy of art, and all of these new ways of working that I'm calling postformalism pressured viewers, if you want to call them that, to rely on senses other than vision, or even extrasensory means to perceive a work. And in doing so, they also moved outside the boundedness of that gallery situation. Robert Barry, who you see here, what he is essentially doing is releasing argon gas. So this is the little file that he's using. He's doing this around Los Angeles. And he likes to work with materials that you can't really see with the naked eye, but that you could indicate through language. So what we're supposed to be looking at, the inert gas, is something that we can't see, and whose dimensions expand at a rate that we can calculate, but that we can't really experience visually. And instead, Barry creates a set of invisible conditions through which we see the landscape behind it. So it's a kind of invisible, infinitely extensive frame, one with parameters that we can conceive of, but that we can't perceive, which is, by the way, pretty close to Kant's definition of the sublime. This is just another of Barry's pieces that I find touching. So around 1971, it became pretty clear to both artists and critics that forms of environmental thinking were having serious ramifications on the way that we theorize visual art. Systems theory in particular had a powerful impact, and this rather odd diagram is an example of that. It appears in a short essay in 1971 by a man named Rudolf Arnheim, who had been trained as a Gestalt psychologist and in the modernist principles of visual composition that are promoted by the Bauhaus and that we still use in our Foundations art courses. And his essay, called Entropy and Art, was written in response to the ascent of entropy as a very common term within the visual arts. And you can see it in particular in works like this, works that explore the degradation of form. This is by Robert Smithson. It consists of one woodshed and 20 loads of earth on top of it. The piece is done when the center post in the woodshed cracks. Smithson had written an essay in 1966 called Entropy and the New Monuments, and it was probably the most famous argument made by a visual artist for disorder as a kind of visual condition. And Smithson was really indicative of a very common rejection of order that was assaulting the boundary conditions upon which Gestalt psychologists like Arnheim are arguing that vision needs. And because vision in the Gestalt model confirms both the order of our own perceptual apparatus and the orderly nature of the physical processes that underlie that apparatus, the failure of the boundary endangers both subjective coherence and physical survival. Arnheim says early in the essay that order is our prerequisite for survival. So at the end of the 1960s, composition and the perceptual psychology behind it is sort of an aesthetic linchpin between notions of a coherent, stable subject and an understanding of the natural world as ordered, vigorous, and healthful. So this is a kind of triangular relationship that creates very unlikely correspondences between the efforts of the Bauhaus old guard to conserve an outdated vision of composition and efforts of ecologically minded artists to achieve a very different sort of conservation. And system psychology becomes their common language. So in 71, Arnheim rejects certain kinds of art that he sees as essentially misunderstanding natural systems. And in particular, he rejects the embrace of randomness and chance, something that we might call formlessness or aleatory practices, but that he calls catabolic destruction. And also what he calls the tendency to tension reduction or ordering, which we would know as minimalism or repetition. And just to give you a sense of what that looks like, this is the kind of work that he's rejecting, that he's seeing as misunderstanding composition. Tension reduction in the case of Tony Smith's Die catabolic destruction in the case of Robert Morris's thread waste pieces, which are simply cast on the floor. So too formless for him. So systemic closure, right, is a kind of important trope in Robert Simpson's writing and in all of the writing around entropy. So as a corrective, what Arnheim is offering us is something that counteracts this kind of deadly closure, and instead participates in a kind of stream of absorbed and expended energy in order to achieve a homeostatic balance. And he calls this the anabolic, and that's what you're seeing here on the left as counteracting these sort of entropic processes. These kind of processes on the right, even though in this case it's actually drawn from a history of Gestalt observations, fall short of what he calls true order. He says it's mere orderliness. Mere orderliness leads to an increasing improvement and finally to the lowest possible level of structure, no longer clearly distinguishable from chaos, which is the absence of order. Homeostasis is not enough. So Arnheim gives us this counter principle, the anabolic, that I argue dovetails intuitively with the concerns of the Green movement. I probably don't have to tell you that anabolism literally just means the formation of complex proteins in cells. But Arnheim is taking anabolic metaphorically to refer to the purposiveness of nature, of an object, of a concept. He says it establishes what a thing is to be about, whether it's a crystal, a solar system, a society, a machine, a statement of thought, or a work of art. So what he's doing is he's depicting the work of art as a kind of site of struggle between these two Manichaean forces. And this is counterintuitive at this moment, because this is normally the way that you would think about the history of art. You would use a kind of arboreal metaphor, these metaphors of growth and development through time. And instead, what Arnheim is doing, right here's our little tree, is imagining the same eternal struggle repeated in every moment of artistic creation and within every work of art. So at the center of the diagram, what we have is essentially a frame, right? No longer a cell, but a frame that represents the image. So anabolism in this case is countering simplicity with plenitude, a striving for equilibrium with a striving for growth, and even more for Arnheim, he's going to salvage human intention in the compositional process and ultimately meaning in the artistic product. So he's creating a kind of physiological or pseudo-physiological argument for the revival of composition, just as both composition and artistic subjectivity are really of interest to contemporary art. And for people like Arnheim, the environment, but specifically the urban environment, is becoming increasingly chaotic. And the 20th century artistic tradition of working order colludes with this kind of environmental onslaught. So it turns out that there are these kind of survivalist overtones to a lot of art writing in this period. And his argument in Entropy and Art echoes those found elsewhere in art psychology of the moment. People like Jürgen Tepisch, who's at MIT, and who is also a Gestaltist, argues that, quote, every properly functioning human being transforms the visual signals that he receives from outside into structured, meaningful entities. Without the perceptual ordering of his sense responses into images of things in space, man cannot orient himself. Without shaping his physical environment in accordance with these images, he can't survive. And within Arnheim's own discipline of art psychology, two books that you see here were already undermining his conception of a vision that is both structured and structuring. Morse Peckham argued that man's rage for chaos, by which he meant modern artists' tendency to produce all-over compositions rather than orderly arrangements, comes from art's role as a rehearsal for biological adaptation. He says that, quote, art is the exposure to the tensions and problems of a false world so that man may endure exposing himself to the tensions and problems of the real world. So while Peckham and Arnheim essentially agree that man requires order to survive in the world, For Peckham, art serves the purpose of temporarily breaking up old orientations so that a person might be more responsive to a threatening environment. We find similar terms in Anton Ehrenzweig, who understands the creative process through psychoanalysis, through Freud's oceanic feeling. So against the notion that we need stable structures to perceive, Ehrenzweig offers unconscious scanning or de-differentiated vision as important to the creative process. And Robert Smithson is picking up on this kind of constellation of terms, entropy, de-differentiation, the oceanic, and placing them against Arnheim's anabolic, order, containment, gestalt, all of the good form words. So artists and psychologists are both linking this assault on composition to the survival, both metaphoric and literal, of the human race. And while Smithson could kind of prostrate himself before what he calls a succession of man-made systems mired in abandoned hopes, a lot of other people couldn't. And so I want to look at some of those people. Well, I'll stay here for a second. Artists like Hans Hakka, Richard Budelis, Newton and Helen Harrison, Jack Burnham, and Alan Sonfist are all working in this kind of anabolic mode. And I should note that almost all of these artists found themselves in the same place, in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the late 1960s, in and around the Center for Advanced Visual Studies at MIT, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and the Visual and Environmental Studies program at Harvard. So by beginning with this notion of the anabolic, I want to point to anti-entropy as an important concept for the moment. And artwork from this period merges Arnheim's idea of the purposive and meaningful nature of the image with a contemporary emphasis on relationality, non-autonomy, and open-endedness. So this appeals to a younger generation of artists whose work was grounded in a kind of sympathetic nature of systems. And Arnheim's use of the diagram is important to them as a way of explaining the dynamics of visual composition and as an interesting relationship to their use of flowcharts and images from ecology as valid aesthetic and didactic forms. The other thing that the anabolic might do is actually open out the connotative life of ecosystems in this period, in the imaginary of this moment, particularly through its peculiar convergence with a second term that comes up, which is alchemy. So this is the way we normally talk about art and environment. Most of the time, this is what people think I'm going to talk about. These are large-scale pieces of land art. One of these is near us, actually, in Utah. And these have dominated histories of ecological art. Typically, they're read as kind of utopian escapes from the gallery system in New York and LA, and ironically at a kind of distance from issues of environmental conservation. For instance, in 2005, there was a big art forum roundtable talking about the work of these two artists, Michael Heiser and Robert Smithson. And what they focused on was the physical remoteness of land art from the kind of gallery, museum, studio networks of New York. For members of the panel, the sandstone mesas of Nevada or the salt flats of Utah serve as temporary shelters for a kind of besieged aesthetic. Big, beautiful, monumental objects. So the naturalized aesthetic object and this transcendent subject in this case aren't dead, they've just been banished, right, away from the political, social, economic systems of civilization, only to return to it, ultimately. So despite the best efforts of a lot of revisionist historians, land art is still considered a product of the American West, drawing part of its aesthetic and rhetorical power from the romantic traditions of American landscape painting, and part from a newly expanded relationship it proposed between sculpture and site or location. So even though land art is central to a history of art and ecology, it's often difficult to really think about anything ecological in connection with it. Environment in the 70s still really referred to the spatial round sculpture, the environment that the work sits in. And it wasn't really until the 1980s that Alan Sonfist, who wrote a survey of environmental art, starts to use the term in relation to ecology. And in order to do this, he actually has to kind of create a spectrum. On one end are things like this, monuments monumental art of wide open spaces that he says were built to speak only of themselves. And then on the other end is art that he says is small scale. It functions in sympathy with natural processes. And those kinds of works I want to look at. They often occur in East Coast galleries. And as I say, they're often quieter and much smaller. These are two examples by Hans Hakka, Condensation Floor and Condensation Cube. And Hakka, who's a German artist, was one of many artists who were actually interested in dealing with simple natural processes in the 60s. And these systems grew out of his contact with a group of artists called Group Zero in Germany, who were working with a lot of the same kind of physio-perceptual principles that people like Arnheim are. And Hakka is drawn to their very cool, very anti-subjective, anti-romantic elements. And especially the way that Group Zero emphasized viewer interaction, their reliance on the grid as a way to organize perception. The difference, though, is that Hakka, unlike Arnheim or Group Zero, is much more interested in the things we can't see than the things that we can. And what he wants to explore are these very simple transformations and processes that he basically imports from the natural world as kind of found objects, in order, as he says, to point to the elements, systems, and forces around which our phenomenal world coheres. So where experience might come from. And the boxes capture these ideas fairly elegantly. They were produced in the mid-1960s, and what all they are is plexiglass containers with water inside of them. And they sit very still in the gallery, and the water inside them slowly cycles from a liquid to a gaseous state and back again. The boxes, or the processes that the boxes contain, are necessarily responsive to environmental factors and even to the body heat of the people viewing them. So work like this, it doesn't ever really leave the art system that land art rejects, or at least postpones. And a number of artists are displaying these very simple systems in the gallery. These are kind of hothouse crypts. I'm going to show you a few more. This is another of Hakka's pieces, chicken hatching. This is a fire piece by John Van Son. It is what it looks like. This is a work by Takis, which is using simple magnets and needles in order to create sort of levitating pieces. So very simple systems. These are kind of hothouse growths that might be better understood in relationship to Arnheim's call to conserve the conventions of traditional art making by couching them in the legitimizing language of physiology and of systems. What these artists are doing, instead of conserving the aesthetic in the way that Arnheim wants to, conserving the visual, they're conserving the aesthetic by transmuting it into forms that are kind of other than visual, into non-visual terms. This makes sense given the history of aesthetic discourse, which has always used physical processes metaphorically. Moholy-Nagy and Georgi Kepes, who are both important teachers of formalism, both treated the artist as a, quote, organism who visualizes everything in relationship. And it's out of this environment of Bauhaus-derived, Gestalt-inflected design theory that both Arnheim and Hans Hakka are coming. Hakka talks about freeing sculpture from its romantic associations with form, which in the past, he says, only had meaning at the grace of the viewer. And he does this by presenting natural processes as intrinsically meaningful, as separate from the viewer, as not needing him or her. So Hakka takes processes like freezing, condensation, photosynthesis as conscious and purpose-driven entities. He says they have to be allowed to perform or have their way. So even given his interest in or indifference to subjective emotion, he uses this kind of animistic language that suggests that once isolated and displayed, a simple system could attain kind of near sentience. The condensation boxes, like these, were shown alongside these other works that you see here at New Alchemy in 1971. John Van Son's fire pieces, the levitating needles of Takis' magnetic sculptures. And the curator, Dennis Young, talked about this work as refuting a kind of instantaneous or grasping vision associated with the sciences. Something, the kind of vision that Heidegger would say sunders and compartmentalizes the world. And they counter this way of looking by slowing vision down, by encouraging the viewer to tarry with what Jung calls a new beauty, by enhancing our appreciation of the phenomena themselves, their essentially restless yet reticent presence in our lives. So the cycling of water from gas to liquid in Hakka's condensation floor, or the growth of plants in grass growing, which is literally just grass growing, happen with a kind of excruciating slowness that marks most natural processes. So the transformation that the viewer is asked to see, asked to witness, is actually unviewable. To see the transformative process, the viewer has to perform a kind of inverted gestalt in order to see in an experience constant the non-variable. So Dennis Young, the curator, shies away from directly linking these artists' work to the occult, but he does acknowledge that there is a kind of intermingling of scientific, transcendental, and phenomenological approaches in these works of transmutation. And it signals a kind of return to a pre-modern approach to the world, something that they say predates atomistic science. Hakka's condensation boxes, or his chicken hatcheries, which I'll show you another picture of in a minute, draw on the kind of power or objective validity of nature. Combustion, magnetism, corrosion, cell mitosis are all very intractable in their material facticity. And Hakka values them for their capacity to act as evidence of invisible, intrinsically meaningful processes. The artist writes that these processes evolve without our empathy. The viewer becomes a witness. A system is not imagined, it is real. And that's important that it evolves without the viewer's empathy, because empathy in the German tradition was associated with enclosed form, and in particular, anthropomorphic form. So forms have meaning because of their relation to humanity. And he's taking away that idea. So Hakka's work is aspiring to a kind of empirical authority that's not available to traditional compositional strategies like empathy, by using processes that aren't immediately available to vision, or that don't require the viewer in order to be complete. This is Frederick Church's Niagara Falls. I just think it's a very nice contrast here in approaches to natural processes. But Hakka's not really ready to get rid of images or of visuality, which are still very central, if problematic, components of environmental art making. The problem, he says, with vision is that we seem to be so accustomed to looking at the gestalt of natural phenomena and to interpreting it in a heartwarming, romantic manner that we neglect to perceive the physical laws forming the gestalt. So his works of art, he wants to stop acting as representational and instead become representative samples, a fraction of the, quote, physical laws forming a total gestalt. So Hakka systems and the other systems that were in the New Alchemy show in 1970 generally invoke a kind of greater, all-encompassing image world from which they're all just extracting. So like Robert Barry, the one doing those inert gas pieces, Hakka's imagining his sculptures as infinitely expansive. A system, in Hakka's words, reaches beyond the space that it materially occupies. So this idea of expansiveness itself already recalls kind of transcendental or even pantheistic cosmologies. His works with living creatures, he has a piece with ants, a piece with goats, and my favorite piece, 10 turtles set free, which you can imagine. He calls them all Franciscan. And he's continually referring again to the gallery visitor as a witness rather than a spectator or viewer, a kind of ethical position for our gallery goers. Which goes some way toward characterizing the kind of experience he wants you to have. In 1967, an important critic of systems, Jack Burnham, draws a kind of inevitable comparison between Hakka's sculptures and what he calls the pre-scientific poetry of Leonardo. Dennis Cosgrove will call this Renaissance environmentalism. That is, a simultaneous embrace of a seemingly contradictory view of nature, a fideistic and hermetic train comparable to the late Renaissance that that we associate with alchemy, and a, quote, empirical, rational, or mechanical philosophy of modernity. The ecological movement beginning in the late 1960s is looking for meaning through synthesis, through unity, things that were values to a kind of pre-scientific alchemical worldview, rather than meaning through distinction or difference. His ability, according to Cosgrove, to experience meaningful rhythms beyond the fragments of the world is an experience that you can only realize in images. And here are a couple of the other pieces I was talking about. This is grass grows and a larger view of chickens hatching. So this alchemical sensibility, which is what the curator of the show is calling it, is in some sense an ecological inversion of a common strategy in the art world of the 1960s, and particularly common to the far more prominent minimalist artists like this. This is Sol LeWitt, Open Cube. In 1967, one critic of minimalist sculpture, Boxer, points out that serial objects from people like Sol LeWitt or Dan Slavin or Carl Andre work with a very simple, very additive logic, 1 + 1 + 1 + 1, that's driven by an essentially arbitrary accumulation of one thing after another. So work like LeWitt's, he wrote, remains simply a mass of data, lines, joints, angles, that imply but never yield a motivated logic. Some may say, he says, and justifiably, that there is a poetry or a power or some other quality to this work which an approach such as LeWitt's misses. But aspects such as those exist for individuals and are difficult to deal with using conventional meanings for words. Others may claim that given this, they are still bored. If this is the case, their boredom may be a product of being forced to view things not as sacred, but as they probably are, autonomous and indifferent. So natural systems like grass grows or chickens hatching don't really work with the same kind of additive logic LeWitt's open cubes. Rather, they work with a different kind of math, the exponential growth or decay of cells, or decay of radium. They are anabolic counters to LeWitt's catabolic structures. So to stand in the presence of systems like these is to bear witness to the non-arbitrary character of natural science and the sacredness that something like this rejects. So this recourse to alchemy is one way of describing new ecosystemic artwork. And people like Dennis Young and Jack Burnham are writing about these artists as unlocking a new non-rational or ritualistic content, something brought from the kind of lineage of Duchamp. So despite their seeming rationalism, they in fact are about ritual and about the sacred. That in things like this. This is a diagram by an art critic, and what it's explaining is a work of art. It's by Jack Burnham. Jack Burnham goes so far as to use mystical alchemical elements of earth, fire, water, and air as 4 poles on a Klein group, or 4 points on a Klein group that he uses to analyze Duchamp's work, or Robert Morris's installations. It's a diagram, right? It is much like a structuralist diagram. Alchemy and the Kabbalah are all providing hermeneutics. They can be applicable to systems, to artwork, without recourse to artistic intention. So he's seeing a relationship between these kind of diagrammatic accounts coming from structuralism, but also coming from a history of mysticism. So the diagram itself provides a way of producing meaning out of the seemingly arbitrary through the natural human capacity for sense-making. All Burnham has to do is manipulate the elements of this diagram to reveal the meaning of an artwork that's secreted inside of it. Art, this kind of survivalist art, works in a sort of twofold process of validation. And the diagram allows for this validation. On one side is of the art-making process is Arnheim's incorporation of order and meaningfulness in the production of old art. On the other side is things like this, a critical hermeneutic project of revealing and confirming underlying order in works of art. So the cellular form, this synchronic form, represents the possibility of recovering intention and meaning after all of these kind of assaults on artistic subjectivity. This is a work by Alan Sonfis called Ants. All he has done is created a nice, pretty gestalt form out of sugar and then let the ants go to work and photographed them. So for the kinds of works that Arnheim is interested, that Hakka is interested in, that Dennis Young is interested in, the problem of the visual image becomes a project of setting an immediate visual impression, the flame, the condensation, the ants, against an imagined gestalt, a hidden order, which is a kind of slow program that's unfolding just below the surface of our phenomenal experience. And the tasks of these artists is to train the viewer to see that underlying program, to mistrust images that describe the world as static or its objects as isolated. This is very important. Alan Sonfis' early environmental works are very close to Hakka's in both material and intent. They both work with social animals like ants or schooling fish, and they document the continually shifting visual structure of the natural world. And in an artist statement from the late 60s, Sonfis talks about this. He says, "We must become more and more sensitive in our perceptions of nature if we're to save it at all. A single visual image is only a segment in a total process. And it forms only one stage in the continuum shaped by other, perhaps invisible factors." So like Arnheim's cellular model that I started with, the diagrams and flow charts of ecosystems collapsed the relation between the thing and its representation, which is a distance that people like Robert Smithson were always trying to reiterate. Diagrams, diagrams, diagrams. So what the diagram and the diagrammatic form of the sculptures themselves stress is that there is a kind of sympathetic relationship within the world. And trying to translate these relationships into vision, consciousness, and agency. Burnham here is actually borrowing the Klein group from Claude Lévi-Strauss and his studies on myths. And he read the fundamental oppositions of the Klein group like an alchemist, right? Folding the two Manichaean forces of Arnheim's anabolic sketch into the four corners of the Klein field. Rosalind Krauss is doing something very similar when she analyzes contemporary sculpture and its relationship to sight. The difference is that she is really looking for differences, to articulate differences. Burnham's really looking to articulate resemblances, similarities. So to Burnham and to Arnheim, the world of nature and the world of vision is a world of correspondences, the product of the combination and recombination of a few essential elements. These should look familiar to you, probably. So they're seeing diagrams everywhere. Not only are they seeing them coming from structuralism, they're also seeing diagrams coming from Howard T. Odum, Eugene Odum. So the problematic place of the image in ecological art is really best exemplified by some of the Odum's charts or mappings. Howard Odum, of course, is treating systems as black boxes, thinking about inflows and outflows without thinking about internal changes, advocating a symbolic language over complex verbal explanation, creating energy circuit diagrams as simplified descriptions of ecological systems. So they represent a kind of web of interconnection that binds ecosystems together and renders each element dependent on other elements. They're very close to the kind of respiratory form of Arnheim's diagram than they are to Burnham's very static mapping. And artists are noticing the usefulness of flowcharts as the Odums are employing them and its ability to reduce a very complex biological interaction to a daisy chain of closed, comprehensible systems. But it can also express, right, the infinite interlocking of these chains into a global ecosystem. So artists are thinking about flow and thinking about flow charts and ways that they can depict connection. This is a work called Eel Track by Richard Budelis. So they start to use these forms of visualization. This was shown as part of Virginia Gunter's Elements of Art show at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and it is a vinyl labyrinth filled with water and 100 eels. The viewer must move kind of in and around this labyrinth and is encouraged by Budelis to find the continual patterns and rhythms behind the eel's myth, as well as to interrupt these patterns and to interact with them. This piece was wildly popular when it was shown, and it required upkeep by handlers from the New England Aquarium and a constant flow of oxygen that was pumped into the water to keep the animals alive. So over the course of the exhibit, the temperature in the gallery was slowly increased to approximate the natural temperature changes that would signal the beginning of mating season for the eels. Too many eels, too little oxygen, the wrong kind of food would unsettle the delicate balance that Budelis had created and lead to the death of the participants. Moreover, and the curator notes this, the zigzag sort of path that he's creating here calls the kind of mystical framework of the exhibition. Remember, it was shown at an Elements of Art exhibition, so again calling up that kind of alchemical context. And the curator actually compared a lot of the works in the show to ancient monuments. Monuments we're supposed to experience kinesthetically or on the ground. And she connects this kind of processual viewing to, everybody's sick. She connects this kind of process of viewing to a kind of spiritual process, a kind of fundamental spirituality at work in all of these natural pieces. The Element show included a lot of the same people that we saw before, those fire pieces, works by Hans Hakka, everybody who was in New Alchemy. And Gunter brought them together under a common banner. She said, what in comparison with Renaissance expression may seem today to be an overt secularism in both art and life, especially in the artist's use of the corporeal, is actually a refocusing upon spirituality. This is another piece by the same artist. It's called Carp and Apple Blossoms. And it's shown the same year. It is live carp who are in these small water-filled bags. They're vinyl sacks on the floor. They're attached by thin plastic tubing to a series of apple branches that both feed on and hopefully help oxygenate the water. Viewed from above, I don't have this image, but viewed from above, it looks like one of Odum's flowcharts. We have these sort of connective lines. It looks as though it is both drawn and living, each component connected to another. So in keeping with Hakka and Sonfist's understanding of nature as a system of motivated signs, Budelis provides the means for its own representation. But it also guarantees its own obsolescence. Eventually, these branches wither and die and signal the end of the piece. So this kind of penchant for simple elemental systems or simple processes expands pretty rapidly to include complex ecosystems produced for the gallery. Since 1970, the artists Helen and Newton Harrison have been using visual strategies against entropy, alongside this aesthetic of reproduction and growth and ritualism. The first work that they produced was simply a single lily cell, so again, recalling Arnheim's cell metaphor, but eventually grows to encompass lagoons, estuaries, and even work about the world ocean. This piece is called Notations on the Ecosystems of the Great Western Saltworks from 1971. And it's part of a group of works called their Survival Series, which culminates in a work called the Lagoon Cycle. And this is the second piece in the series, shown at the Art and Technology exhibition at LACMA. And it's basically a series of outdoor open tanks with a very simple, discrete ecosystem, brine shrimp and Dunley algae. that you can see here in various stages of salinity, so that the color changes whether there's predominantly algae or brine shrimp in the pond. And at the end of the event, they were harvested for both salt and shrimp, and they did eat the shrimp. They did not like them. So these are mimicking the conditions of California's salt ponds. And the resulting color change is very intentionally compared to other kinds of image making. These are essentially paintings, or as the artist jokes, these are Ellsworth Kellys in fish guts. So they're at once a kind of invisible system, but subsumed by a compositional image. Arnheim will continue to argue for a return to the composed two-dimensional image throughout the 70s. He will continue to argue for the primacy of vision. Even after the turn within the art world no longer made that primacy possible. Still, our cellular model for thinking about art offers one way out of the kind of arboreal developmental models of progress that historians are used to using. He claims that this kind of healthful striving, or as well as a kind of proper mystical balance of the right antagonism, could replace the model of avant-garde development that had driven art criticism, particularly criticism about painting. The Harrisons are working with living will symbolically, however, only in the most literal sense, that it thrives materially, that it encourages ecological rather than compositional complexity. Likewise, they recast Arnheim's unique existential subject in terms of a kind of identity that was subject to the material and social conditions that determine physical, not so much subjective, survival. This is another piece from the survival piece called The Portable Fish Farm from 1971. The brine that are used in notations become a part of a larger system. They are pasture number 5 within Fish Farm. And it's a farming mechanism that they proposed to end world hunger in 1971 that involves the ritual harvesting of catfish, who that's what's being viewed here are the catfish. At the end of the piece, they have a kind of ritual feasting that takes place. So productivity is the goal here. That's the full realization of the open system's potential, and the point at which the artwork literally enters the viewer. So for Harrison, it allows the work of art to escape from what he saw as a kind of literally deadly self-referentiality, the kind of self-criticism of modern painting. And it begins to elevate utility, usefulness, to an aesthetic value. As I said, this is task number 5, those brine shrimp. As I said, this will continue to expand. This work will ultimately become part of the lagoon cycle, and these are some of the images associated with that cycle. It is a multi-part installation, performance, poem, and ecosystem that they produce as part of this cycle. So the scope of their project is quickly outgrowing the gallery, leaving them to rely on visual supplements like photographs and diagrams and maps, and a performance between the lagoon maker, who is Harrison, and the witness, right? Again, calling up this idea of a witness, who is Helen Harrison. So there is a kind of poetic or reverential quality to this work that acts as a foil to the very investigative spirit of the earlier work. So it calls up again Cosgrove's description of this moment as very contradictory, as pulling together images from the sacred and from the objective. Oops. Last image. So this is an image from Hakka. So this is where the work goes. This is where those condensation cubes go. This is Rhine water purification plant. He's already beginning to shift his attention from pure natural systems to the political and social systems that determine them. In 1972, Rhine water purification plant is installed in Krefeld, Germany, and he intervenes in a specific ecological situation. Recycling discharge from a nearby sewage plant, you can see on the upper left, that would otherwise have been released into the Rhine River. Hakka's sort of mini plant cycles the murky contents of all of these carboys through a series of chemical sand and charcoal filters, eventually sending clear water into a pool of live goldfish where it passed through a hose into the museum's garden below. So like the edible fish and shrimp of Harrison's projects, Hakka's Rhine water transforms this kind of useless starting material into something that is life-sustaining, potable water. So where Arnheim saw this idea of the anabolic as a way of conserving the conventions of traditional art making, he opens up the possibility that the implied energies of composition might be preserved by sublimating them quite literally into other forms of energy. He couldn't have anticipated work like Hakka's, but still Arnheim's diagram that I began with offers a potential for a kind of organicism that's not burdened by modernist narratives of progress, or by Smithson's geological inversion of that narrative, his entropic narrative. The anabolic literally interprets productivity, growth, potability, edibility, that is tangible contributions to the world beyond the gallery, as viable measures of an ecological artwork's success. And there are other artists who do this as well. Bonnie Shirk, Agnes Dennis, Phoebe Washburn are a few other examples. So this leads us away from a very familiar narrative of institutional critique, which is normally how this work is interpreted, to one of tangible social change. The Rhine water is taking part in the same kind of transmutation of the New Alchemy show, the diagrammatic image of Budellis's ecosystem, and the utilitarian productivity of the Harrison fish farms. At the same time, it completes this transition begun by those early condensation boxes from a gestalt based on form to one based on structure that literally opens out into the world. And by 1972, it was clear that this impulse to connect, that these live systems engaged, did not involve that kind of conventional gestalt of form, but the human proclivity to map. A proclivity that in the age of the internet, of course, we're very reliant upon. So like phenomenology or cybernetics, this alchemical approach was one way of resisting an atomistic worldview. In this case, the revival of metaphor and analogy were useful political and pictorial strategies. They joined the alchemical reliance on the image with the anabolic or open system in order to yield what Newton and Helen Harrison have characterized as continuous empathy, which is interesting in that empathy, I've just said, is a very anthropocentric idea. So they ground the visual apprehension of an autonomous form, their invocation of empathy, as continuous. That is, as not based on a singular form that is necessarily recognizable as anthropomorphic, something that moves out into the world. That difference seems to me to be at the crux of these artists' work, their collective tendency to combine actual physical relationships with the production of those relationships as images, suggests to me a very urgent desire during this period to resolve a person's subjectedness to a system, whether that's an ecosystem, an art system, an economic system, with one's agency as a viewer or a citizen or a subject. So in such a context, terms like anabolism could synthesize the automatic with the purposive, the literal with the metaphorical, and could be very powerful as a social currency. So this term, continuous empathy, that the Harrisons are using, calls for a kind of continual acknowledgement of the intuited state of the other, whether that's non-human, whether that's the environment. In a world where that other no longer comprised singular objects or subjects, but a series of systems. A world that's already very close to that pre-modern notion of a sympathetic universe. I'm going to stop there because we're running out of time, and I've talked a lot. Thank you.